Hey guys, Ramsey here. Welcome to another video. Today we have a new review on an Areej Le Dore that I have yet to do a full review on the channel. I know when I did my previous Areej Le Dore review, I said that it was actually the last full bottle of Areej Le Dore that I have not reviewed, and that was Russian Musk. And that was actually true of the classics line, right? But there is a line of fragrances I ended up buying the entire set of. Thank God I did, because I absolutely love them. They've been my go-to ouds lately, and it is the History of Oud collection. And I have a couple live streams on the channel about it. One is an unboxing, and the other is actually like a first impressions live stream that I did. So if you want to kind of know my thoughts on many of these fragrances, check them out. The bottles look like this. So today we're going to be talking about the History of Chinese Oud, which is probably one of the most challenging and animalic ouds in the collection. It is also probably the most challenging to describe. Okay, so a couple things I'm going to mention from the very beginning. Number one, I'm going to use a lot of imagery in this review because describing to you how this actually smells is proving increasingly difficult. I don't know if I even have the vocabulary to do it, but I know I can tell you what pops into my head. There may be some weird images, but I think that might be the best way to describe the way that this fragrance wears and feels. The second thing is I do have a review of one of these already. I reviewed Indian Oud, which I actually reviewed at the request of Russian Adam because he said that was his favorite from the collection. And so there are some more still to review. There's Bengal Oud, there's Indonesian Oud. So there are some other full bottles from this collection that I have yet to review, which I will, and they deserve it because honestly, you know, what Russian Adam told me, interestingly enough, he said, I really feel like I created as many different types of oud fragrances as I could. You know, I did oud with coffee and oud with rose and oud with all of these different things. And it got to a point where I figured the best way to really show my true love of oud to the public is to show it to them in its true form. And so most of these, outside of Quinam Oud, the History of Quinam Oud has some other notes added, but the majority of these fragrances in this collection is just oud. So it is just oud. And it's crazy how multifaceted and how much depth, and it's like wearing a fragrance. It really is. Even though it's just oud, it's really like wearing a fragrance. There's so much depth and detail, and you'll see from my review of the History of Chinese Oud. So this basically, I'll read you the little blurb, okay? So there's a little blurb on each one, and the History of Chinese Oud says, distilled in the year 2004, this wild Chinese Agarwood oil was made into a sprayable perfume, making it one of a kind due to the extreme rarity of this material. Sinking wild Chinese agarwood chip vapors were then infused into the top notes by Russian Adam to deliver an unmatchable experience to the wearer. Let us cherish and enjoy the beauty of old Chinese oud. Okay, so a couple things that you should know, and I guess this can get a little bit confusing for some people, but what I will say is that there is a fragrance from the house of Areej Le Dore, which came out in the year 2021, called Chinese Oud. And to make it even more confusing, look at the packaging on this 10 mil, by the way. These little 10 mils are, I would say they are to be cherished. These little 10 mil decants. Discovery atomizers. I wish I had a full bottle. It was actually one of the fragrances that got re-released in his new classics collection, which just came out within the last week or so. Obviously, unfortunately, I can't buy any fragrances, but I love this. I have a review of this, but it actually came from a small little sample that Russian Adam sent me before I ended up finding the 10 ml decant. I wish I would have been able to secure a full bottle because I absolutely love this scent, but long story short, if you want to hear my thoughts on the fragrance Chinese Oud, which uses the same 2004 Chinese Oud that is actually used in the history of Chinese Oud. So if that makes it even more confusing, I apologize. I'm trying to make it less confusing, not more confusing. But basically, the oud that is in this, the 2004 wild, rare Chinese agarwood, is the oud that's used in this Chinese oud from 2021, but this is a composition. So this also has things like aldehydes, orange, Chinese Rose Atto, Chinese Gardenia CO2, Chinese Jasmine Absolute, Mysore Sandalwood, Indonesian Vanilla, Patchouli, and Oak Moss. So it's a whole fragrance, basically, Chinese oud. This one from 2021. This, the history of Chinese oud, is just oud. It's just the oud, if that makes sense. So it's like picking out the oud note and amplifying it, right? And I think one of the reasons that this doesn't do well, and by the way, this is one of my favorite woody fragrances of all time. Like if you said, Ramsey, show me your favorite woody scents, this would have to be one of them, because the woody note in here with the Mysore Sandalwood and that Chinese oud is unmatchable. I mean, it is so beautiful, but the problem is it doesn't open up like a gunshot. This one opens up like a nuclear bomb. This one opens up a little calm, almost French in style, with that like aldehydic floral, and the oud comes in later on, and it's so smooth. It's like driving a Phantom. I mean, it really is. It's like you don't feel a thing. You don't feel a bump. You don't feel a shift. You don't feel a damn thing. And you've got the little tarp that covers the back seat, so you're flying and riding in class, right? You don't feel anything in the Phantom, right? That's the idea of the history of Chinese oud to me. It's so smooth, and I think that's the reason why it never really got that much love, because it took a little while, I think, for people to really feel the oud coming in the middle and in the bass notes. And so the people who spray and judge didn't really get the beauty of this, because it probably took some wearings and took some really getting into the base to understand that fragrance. But I think it's absolutely brilliant. So getting back to the history of Chinese oud, which is what we're reviewing today, I just wanted to mention the fragrance Chinese oud, so there, in case anyone had any questions on the differences, this is just the oud note, right? And, you know, I'm going to use a lot of imagery of like digging when I'm discussing the history of Chinese oud. And a book actually came to mind. And the book is this, The Tommy Knockers. Have you guys ever heard of this one? So this is a fantastic book, by the way. I love these old Stephen King books. When Stephen King looked like this, that man could write. And there's an interesting little tale with this, but Tommies was basically like an archaic British slang word for rations, for army rations. And so, you know, a Tommy was like was a ration. And there's a poem that goes along with this, but that's not the reason why I thought of this book. The poem is, late last night and the night before, Tommy knockers, knocking at my door. I want to go out, don't know if I can, because I'm so afraid of the Tommy knocker man. So that's an old traditional poem. Now the book, the thing that got me thinking about Tommy knockers is, and the story is sort of completely different from army rations or anything like that. It's about this lady who owns this big chunk of land in God knows where, and probably up in Rhode Island or something. I can't remember exactly where, but she owns this huge plot of land, like her father gifted it to her or something. I read this like over a decade ago, so I'm really going off of memory here. But she's like walking along in her land, and she kicks something, and she looks down, and there's this little tiny piece sticking out. Almost, she thinks it's like the side of a Coke can, like sticking out. So she starts to pull at it, you know, and she realizes it's much bigger than a Coke can. So she figures it's like a, you know, I don't know, like a piece of metal. She digs further and she realizes it's much bigger than a piece of metal. Well, long story short, it's an alien spaceship. And the more it digs and she frees it up, the more the signals from the spaceship is able to sort of influence her, right? And there was this connection, as I was thinking, between sort of the digging, because there's going to be a lot of digging references when I discuss the history of Chinese oud, and like this influence that it has on you, because it's like the deeper you go, the more I think I fall in love with this fragrance. And I really feel like the history of Chinese oud for me is what I would call a red letter oud. And if you guys know what a red letter is, it's basically a letter that is supposed to signify a memorable event, okay? People use red letters for things like marriage and stuff like that, right? This oud is one of those ouds that will completely change, I think, the trajectory of the way that you see and think about oud. It is completely different than anything else I've ever smelled. I've never smelled another oud like this before. And maybe there are some big-time oud lovers that have, but for me, this is singular. This is unique. This is different. This fits all of the things that I look for when I want a real oud fragrance. It opens up to me very dusty, dry, extremely dry, animalic, and earthy. Earthy is the big word. There's a lot of fungus references in this. So I think about things like mushrooms. Burnt mushrooms actually come to mind. So things like burnt mushrooms come to mind, funguses and earthy and dirt, soil. And excuse me, it's easily probably one of the most animalic ouds in the collection. It almost feels like there's a note of civet. The oud is so animalic in here that it feels like you're smelling civet, or, you know, civet paste or castoreum tincture, or, you know, there is even a little bit of a metallic, maybe slightly like, in one of the reviews that I did recently, Ladano Nero, there was a slate note. And so the slate note gave it a little bit of a mineralic feel. There is a little bit of that in here, like this earthiness, like you're digging in the earth and you uncover this piece of slate that's been buried. So you're not just smelling the mineral note, you're also smelling like this dirt, this soil that was also buried, right? You know how buried dirt sometimes smells different than topsoil? So imagine like a piece of mineralic note that's buried, right? And you dug it up. And so in your hand is not just the slate note, but it's also a pile of earth that it was in. You haven't yet dusted it all off, right? That's a little bit of the smell. And there is something I would say in the first half an hour that really feels like you're smelling something from the earth. You know, it really feels earthy and soily. I can't emphasize that enough. But it also smells slightly cheesy in the first half an hour, okay? Cheesy is a word that gets used in a lot of oud reviews, I would say. People say things smell like blue cheese and stuff like that. And I've smelled a lot of oud fragrances, and many times when I smell an oud, I don't get the cheesy aspect of it. This oud is cheesy. This is actually one of the most cheesy ouds I think I've ever smelled. It literally smells like molding cheese. There's a little bit of this rotting, molding cheese aspect to it. And like I said, many times when people say that, I don't get that note. Here I do. There is definitely this chunky blue cheese-like note that tends to come through, but it's mixed with that animalic civet smoky opening, okay? That's sort of what you get, is you get that animalic civet smoky opening. And imagine it being from the earth. So imagine that, you know, you're digging, just like our friend in the Tommy Knocker's book is digging and she finds the spaceship. You're digging and you basically come across mushrooms. You come across things like mushrooms or fungus. Imagine some sort of fungus. Probably the way that I would describe it to somebody who's never smelled the history of Chinese oud. By the way, I have a 10-hour dry down here and I can still smell it. Literally clear as day. This is an absolute beast of a performer. And I've got about a 2.5-hour dry down here, and it's brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. I love these woody, smoky type scents. So, you know, imagine like you're out digging and you discover like a fungus that's unknown to the scientific community. That's the way I would describe it to someone who's never smelled this scent. You're uncovering something new. That's the way it feels like to me. I'm sure it's not new, but to many people, this would be a new experience. This would be a new type of oud, especially if all you've smelled are some of the designer ouds and stuff like that. I promise you've never smelled anything like this. In fact, even if you've smelled some of Russian Adam's work, if you smelled things like Oud Zen, or if you smelled things like Russian oud, you've never smelled anything like this. Bortnikov's ouds don't smell like this. Ensar's ouds don't smell like this. You know, there's Rising Phoenix's ouds do not smell like this. Even the oud Sultan Pasha's been using in his atars, which I've been testing lately before I go to bed, and they are brilliant. And I want to make sure I give those reviews the full dedication they deserve, because his work is, I mean, he is the Mozart of atars. If money was no object for me, and I was an atar guy, I would wear nothing but Sultan Pasha. The guy is brilliant. But this mushroomy fungus quality keeps coming up. You know, there really is something about it. And so, you know, imagine being in a specific part of the forest, and imagine you're in this part of the forest where this fire raged, okay, days ago, let's say. Let's say the fire's out, but you're right at that demarcation line where the fire was burning on this side, and let's say the forest is still unburnt on this side, right? And you're right on that burn line. And so between it and part of the forest, let's say, you have this moment of clarity almost. Have you ever had like this moment of clarity where it just seems like every detail, like every single sound, every smell that you smell is you're alert to. You know what I mean? Like, and it's seared into your memory for whatever reason. Usually, when people go through traumatic events, they have that moment of clarity where you just remember things in such detail that normally you don't remember. Small things, maybe like a robin singing over here, or like a smell that you smelled, or what someone said, or something like that, right? Everything just seems like you're just super alert and attentive to everything. And almost like you have the eyes of an eagle, you know, and the sun is brighter. You have the nose of a hound dog, right? The smells seem more vibrant during that time. And so to me, this smells like almost like a blend of burnt and unburnt earth, and also mixed with that oud note. So most people can imagine the woody oud note. I think it's the smoldering, sort of earthy, mushroomy smell that people are not expecting in this. This is the part of the history of Chinese oud that I think is the hardest for me to describe to someone that's never smelled it before. Because now that I've smelled it, this smell is seared into my memory because it's so unique and so different than any other oud I've ever smelled. I've never smelled another oud like this, ever, from anywhere else. And it just smells like a blend of this burnt and unburnt ground mixed with this crazy fungus, you know, this mushroom-like fungus where that burn line, let's say, that I said, right, this half of it's burnt, this half of it's not burnt, falls right in the middle of the mushroom, right? So you get the mushroom smell, but you also have this weird burnt mushroom, you know, like if you've ever played Zelda and you had to cook food and you throw the mushroom in the pot and it like bounces around, you know? Like just imagine this seared mushroom. And even though the fire is out, right? I said you were in this forest where the fire burned days ago. Even though the fire's out, imagine there is something smoldering underneath, right? Like smoke and incense is still sort of coming up through the ground, and it makes no sense to you because the fire's out, right? It stopped burning, but there's something underneath, some sort of eternally burning piece of coal underneath that just burns and will not go out, right? And the word smoldering keeps coming up in my head. I think that's honestly the best way to describe the smoke smell in this, as smoldering. And I think that buried imagery that I started with Tommyknockers, right? So imagine that buried imagery. Imagine look, there's actually the forest. How's that? That's actually a really good image of the forest. So imagine that imagery of it being buried and smoldering underneath the ground, right? And it just won't go out, right? That fire, just there's just something underneath the ground that just will not go out. And so you get this smoky, you know, almost like it's sneaking through the crevices of the earth to let itself out into the world. And your senses are heightened, and so you're smelling all that. You're smelling this burning, incensey, you know, smoldering aspect underneath the ground. And so now that I've made that comparison, there's another comparison that I want to mention. And if you've ever heard me describe two fragrances from the 70s, one is the fragrance Yatagan, one of the best Caron fragrances ever created. Some would argue the best Caron. I've got a backup of this, thank God. Oh, Yatagan. The other is Punjab by Capucci. Fantastic fragrance. I will review both of these one of these days. Oh, I love them both. But both of these fragrances, and the juice color is actually very similar on both too, by the way. But both of these give me this almost like, I would say, you know, image. And I've described this before. If you've been on my channel regularly, you've probably heard me make this description. But imagine you're walking in the woods, and there's like a part of the forest that is, let's say, untouched by humans or animals. There's no folks ruffling around. There's no people walking around and disturbing what is on the forest floor. And let's say leaves have fallen, okay? So the leaves have fallen, and they have sort of, it's starting to turn to fall. The leaves are falling, and let's say no one's been in that part of the forest floor. And so the leaves have now fallen, and they are covering up this part of land, right? And you come along walking, whistling, looking up, not paying attention, and you kick these leaves out of the way. And so while you're walking, you sort of disturb this area that has not been disturbed, right? And while the leaves were there, it almost worked as a blanket, right? Or it almost worked as like an insulator. So all of the fungus and moisture of the ground, this damp earthiness that has been covered up by these leaves in this spot for months, is all of a sudden released. And you get this release of basically ground and area that was covered up. This spot where, let's say, yeast and fungus and all of these different growths have taken place. And this is sort of the toughest part of the explanation for me, because we sort of have to split our thinking. We have to go back to the beginning of the history of Chinese oud, and also about 4 or 5 hours into the future at the same time. Very hard to do. So you sort of have to keep your mind nimble for this exercise. But just imagine you're walking and you kick these leaves up, right? And that smell of the forest floor that, let's say, has been covered up for months potentially, and it's just brewed. Let's say maybe it even rained and the moisture got in there, right? That image of sort of the ground being covered up by leaves, and you make this big reveal when you come along and kick the leaves away. You're walking and you kick the leaves away and you get that whiff of sort of moist, moldy undergrowth, right? Slightly mildewy, right? I want you to imagine like this slightly mildewy area of earth, of forest. And maybe even oddly slimy. Maybe that's the place where like the earthworms and the slugs go to and all of that, right? That is what the fragrance smells like about 3.5 hours in, right? That sort of undisturbed forest floor. And imagine that you're right next to some big, giant, beautiful, old-timey trees, right? So you get some of that wood. You get that traditional oudy woodiness, but it's the strangeness of the mushroomy, mildewy, slimy moisture that I think makes it hard to describe. Because once the animalic opening and that blue cheese opening and that smoldering opening starts to fade away, that's what the fragrance turns into about 3.5 to 5 hours in, and lasts really for the rest of the life of the fragrance. Is this very traditional, woody, almost a little bit paint thinner maybe, a little smoky, woody, not as crazy of a smell 3.5 to 5 hours in as the first hour and a half, maybe even 2 hours, let's say. The animalic opening has a similar vibe, and that's why I say this idea of kicking the leaves out of the way is an important image at the beginning, but also about 3 to 5 hours in, because the animalic opening has this similar vibe in the beginning, except whenever you kick the leaves away in the opening, what you're left with is this image of burning animal fur. And I had no clue how to describe it until I was actually watching a Rich Mitch live stream today, and I heard someone mention burning animal fur, and I was like, holy shit, that is perfect. It is absolutely perfect because it encompasses the smoldering aspect, but it also encompasses that cheesy civet, like, slightly Uranus feel I was describing earlier as well. It's a perfect analogy for the opening of this. You kick away the leaves, and underneath there's I'm not going to say an actual animal, but let's say there's a rabbit foot under there, right? And that rabbit's foot, someone was carrying it along for good luck, and it got dropped or something. The leaves fell on top, and that's what you're smelling was burning. For YouTube, right? But this smoldering, sort of burning animal fur mixed with this smoky feeling, this smoky smolderingness, what ends up happening as the hours go by. So the first hour, you get that cheesy animalic opening, and the smokiness is there, but it's sort of in the background just a little bit. But as you transition to 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes, and half an hour to an hour in, the smoldering aspect of the history of Chinese oud increases exponentially. This increases exponentially, and you start to get more and more of this sort of smoldering aspect. Almost like you dig, the deeper that you dig into the ground, the more you sort of uncover this never-ending burning coal feeling, the more that it influences the way that you smell the fragrance. Hence my thinking about the book Tommyknockers, because the more she digs, the more of the spaceship is uncovered, and the more that sort of the signals from the spaceship are able to influence her and end up ultimately turning the people closest to the ship into aliens. So, so just imagine this sort of never-ending burning coal that you're slowly uncovering as you dig, and you also uncover this new fungus that's never been known to man, right? If you've ever played the game The Last of Us, there's a series about it now. I've never seen the show, but the game is fantastic. The Last of Us. That was caused by like a cordyceps fungus, right? So imagine there's this like fungus that you uncover when you're sort of digging, and no human has ever smelled it. That's the way that it smells. It smells unique. It smells different. It smells challenging. It's everything I want in an oud fragrance. Everything that someone like me wears an oud fragrance for is in the history of Chinese oud. It is absolutely special juice. I cherish this one to no end. Now, I think the history of Indian oud is the other runner-up for the most animalic in this, I would say, little set. But the history of Indian oud has some traditional fermented oud notes that you would normally associate with oud. This is unique. This is very interesting to me. And that's the reason why I think it's easy to say the history of Indian oud is your favorite, because if you like traditional, skanky, fermented, Indian oud, then that fits that profile beautifully. Now, there are things in the history of Indian oud which, are special, like that cherry note, that smooth woodiness, and all the things that it has. I did a review on it. You can go check it out. But this one is like nothing else. I mean, I think this is a very special oud wood. This, and it's a wild oud wood. So, imagine how rare it is nowadays to still find these wild oud trees that have grown for God knows how long, 50, 100 years, 150 years. So for me, the history of Chinese oud is a legend. It gives off that almost lacquered wood smell into the dry down as well. So if you've ever seen those old, if you're into vintage cars, or you watch things like the Barrett-Jackson auction, sometimes they'll roll across the block what's called a woody. And a woody is one of those old wood-paneled station wagons that you think of from like the 1950s, right, or 1960s. And before minivans and all that stuff, they did station wagons, right? And they would have these wood paneled sides, right? And if you've ever been close to one of those and you've smelled it, it has a very specific, like, the way that the wood is finished and treated with this weird, like, lacquered feel, but it also smells a certain way. And that's sort of the feeling of the way that the woodiness in the history of Chinese oud sort of comes. Imagine this old school woody station wagon. So it is just, I mean, and to think this is just the oud. This is just the oud note. So while in the Chinese oud composition, you have to wait hours to sort of get to that. And I love this. This is brilliant fragrance. But this does something very special because it just really highlights that oud note. And you don't have to wait on this one. I mean, as soon as you spray this, it's like the gun is fired, the race is off. And I mean, this is a special for all oud lovers. I would urge you to try to get your nose on this. And I know it's expensive, and I know it's only 22 mils in these little bottles. But man, I mean, I will spray my hands with 2 or 3 sprays, and I can smell it all day long. I mean, like I said, this is 10 or 11 hours now, I think. Yeah, almost 11 hours. And I can smell this clear as day. I mean, I don't have to spray anything else for the rest of the day, although I did here for the channel. But, I mean, this is special juice. So, we're almost at the half an hour mark. I hope you guys who have experienced this little beauty think I did it justice. It is, I'll tell you what, this was a very, very hard review for me to do, because it's so hard to describe the smell of something as unique and different and challenging as this. But if you love challenging fragrances, I would really urge you to try the history of Chinese oud. And actually, believe it or not, I have worn this to work. I've worn this to work, and it is I just think it's one of those things. Sometimes people put fragrances in a box and they're just like, oh, this is so challenging, I could never wear this. I wear it. I wear stuff all over. So, I mean, even though for me, I think it is challenging, I wouldn't hesitate to wear this pretty much anywhere. But if you have smelled it, do leave a comment. I love seeing your faces in the comments. Love the feedback, the support. Thank you to everyone who has done, who has been here for the channel and supported me. I love doing these reviews. I hope to be able to continue to do them well into the future. I have many, many fragrances still to do reviews on and talk about. So thanks everyone. Cheers, guys, and I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.